and answers. So I will take the microphone around, and when I recognize you, if you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Hi, Tasman Powers from Princeton University. My question is sort of directed towards Jeff Sheehy, but it's really open to the whole panel. Obviously, NASA over the last 30 years has been directed to work closer with the commercial industry and private partners. And through public-private partnerships with SpaceX, formerly Orbital, now Northrop, there's been a lot of success with deliveries of cargo to the ISS. Hopefully, we'll see the same success with Crew. And then there's the lunar delivery program to work with industry. In these trade-off studies, both in STIFI or with NASA, are you considering how these kinds of partnerships could bring down costs? And how would a choice of fuel affect the ability to engage in these kinds of partnerships?
Sure. We, in Space Technology Mission Director, we have a lot of solicitations and a lot of projects that are public-private partnerships. The mission director has been emphasizing over the past couple of years releasing a couple of solicitations every year that directly involve public-private partnerships between some of the companies you've mentioned, actually, and the things that we want to accomplish as an agency. Excuse me, I sat here too long. But in any of these systems, there'd be a whole lot of elements to develop, and so. Yeah, the choice of fuel is going to influence who can design and build the reactor. But in a NTP system, there's a vast number of elements to the overall system. That's just one subsystem. In a fission power system, even, there's a number of other elements where, if it turned out that to meet requirements, it had to be HEU fuel, there are other aspects of the overall NTP or our fission power system where commercial entities could contribute. So we are always looking for areas where we can leverage the capability of private entities and have them get involved in developing the technologies and capabilities that we need as an agency. As you mentioned, commercial cargo to the ISS is just one of those. Ultimately, we're going to be flying crews to the ISS commercially, and so we look for that in STMD. We do factor that into everything we do, and so there are a number of places in nuclear thermal propulsion, in fission surface power, and nuclear electric propulsion, which I didn't even talk about, but I'm a huge advocate for. We're just not doing that much on it right now. I think all these things ought to be powered by fusion, by the way. So bring me your fusion device, and we don't have to have this argument at all. I'll let Bobby.
Tasman, I think the subtext to your question is commercial entities can't be involved in HEU activities, and therefore LEU is the way to go if we want commercial. And I absolutely agree with you that whenever commercial partners are involved, there's likely innovation, costs go down. I guess the only, and again, I also agreed with everything Jeff said. The only thing I would say is, I'm assuming you are also thinking that the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 is an inhibitor. I would say make it, some, laws can be changed. I think if whatever is the right way to go, it should be the right way to go. There's a difference between laws of man and laws of nature, right? I mean, if you said, let's change the gravitational constant, I would say, hell no. But, I think we need to kind of think about all factors and not just make certain decisions because of a law that was written back in, a different time.
Other questions?
Hello, everyone. I'm Samantha Rollins. I got my master's in nuclear engineering at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, and I'm now doing my PhD in aerospace engineering, so nuclear space. My question is in regards to the NRC has spent several years looking into trying to actually modify the security and safety requirements for the categories based off of another factor called dilution, which I didn't see listed in your slides, which is essentially just the fuels are not necessarily the same, even though it's a different similar enrichment. The fuel itself is not pure uranium. It has other materials in it. And of course, it's easier to find a needle in a pile of needles than it is to find a needle in a haystack. And so how do you think that this dilution factor could potentially have an impact on proliferation? Do you think that that's something that should have an effect?
Yes, well, actually, can you hear me? The NRC has terminated that particular rulemaking, but it's not clear that, well, certainly for what the near-term programs, the NRC's licensing is not relevant, and DOE already has an attractiveness level criteria which take into account dilution factors. But even so, it would be looking at the alloy for a kilopower reactor, which is less than 10% molybdenum. That would not be sufficient dilution to reduce the attractiveness level, even under the DOE criteria. But putting that aside, I don't believe that dilution, that level of dilution is really a significant factor, because you're not only considering the direct impact or the direct use of the material, but you also have to consider the ability to separate, even if in a dilute material. So you also have to look at the theft of material and the processing of it down the chain, and that affects the analysis. So the dilution is generally not, unless it's considerably dilute, less than 1 or even 0.1% of special nuclear material, I don't think it's adequate to address the security issues.
Hi, Miles Pomper from the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. I had a question for Mr. Sheehy and Mr. King. I'm just curious what the LEU comparison that's being made, what LEU are you comparing this to? Is this high density LEU? Is this current kinds of LEU? What is the yardstick when you're talking about it?
For the NASA implementations, we're generally looking at high SALEU, 19.75%.
Not the assay, but higher density.
So in our study, we were considering the same as kilopower, more or less the same reference fuel. So uranium 7% moly, which is the highest density uranium metal alloy that is currently out there in terms in the research realm. So the U-moly alloys are so you can't go with pure uranium because the metallurgical properties of uranium typically, there's some issues. It does some interesting things at higher temperatures that negate your ability to really power a reactor with pure uranium. So you're looking at, U10 moly, which is U10 to U7 moly, so 93% uranium to 90% to 93% uranium, and that's about the highest atom density you're going to get without something really super exotic that isn't, I think, realistic in any. I mean, I can't even speculate what would be higher than that, than pure,
It's Milton Holding from the International Center for Tourism Studies. I have a quick question for Jeffrey King. Your calculations concentrated on the fuel, and I think you had like 200 kilograms of LEU versus 100 for your HEU, moderated LEU with 100 kilograms of HEU. So this did include the shielding. So when you include the shielding, even though it's your preliminary studies, what is the comparison between the two?
So the comparison was actually reactor plus reflector mass. So about 100 kilograms reactor plus reflector with HEU, and then about 200, a little bit more than 200 with reactor plus reflector. The shield, I don't off the top of my head remember the number. It's at least that kind of mass for the shield, if not more.
So if I understand correctly, it's just the whole thing is 200 versus 100. Factor of 2.
For the reflector and core.
Sorry.
Core plus reflector is about 100 versus 200.
And what is now?
What?
What's the rest of the mass of the system?
I'd have to. I could, if you give me a few minutes, I can pull it up. I don't remember off the top of my head what the rest of the numbers are. Yeah,
I mean, it's 1,000 kilograms for the system, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yes, Steve. I think it's about 1,000 kilograms total. So you're probably another. Yeah, so it's. Yeah, so I can pull it up, but I honestly don't remember. I remember the total. I don't want to throw a number out there without going and looking at my notes. High likelihood of being wrong. So if you give me a minute, I can get it. But
discuss that later.
Yeah.
Joseph Kohler, Aerospace Corporation. I have a question on, can you speak a little bit more to the production steps of LEU, in particular when LEU is generated by downblending HEU, and how does that affect the trade-off study, in particular the calculus on perception, proliferation risks, and general opposition when you go through a step of generating HEU first?
Did someone else want? Well, right. So if you're talking about production of high-assay LEU for space reactors, and that's a material that's in very short supply. The U.S. obtains it currently primarily by downblending highly enriched uranium excess stocks. So it is true that if there are a lot of different advanced reactor systems that would require large amounts of high-assay LEU, which is not currently being produced. And so this would be one competing use for that material. And it certainly is an issue if, current enrichment companies, if they had sufficient financial incentive and guarantees, could produce the material. But right now they don't see the market for it. And so they're reluctant to step in. And at the same time, the Department of Energy is pushing the idea that we need new fully domestic U.S. origin enrichment in order to support national security missions like microreactors for military bases. And the claim is that would have to be U.S. origin. And so if that were true, there would be a proliferation signal by the U.S. saying that it's a valuable thing to do to build domestic military enrichment facilities for national security or military purposes, which is the wrong message I think we want to be sending the rest of the world today to countries like, say, Saudi Arabia. So there is an issue with the indigenous production of high-assay LEU if it's under these auspices, but for a civilian mission, that shouldn't be an issue. And also even for terrestrial electrical power, even if it's for defense purposes, it's very unclear whether peaceful use restrictions will prevent that. So it's a long answer, but there would need to be sufficient financial incentive for the private sector to produce that material. But it wouldn't be necessarily a proliferation issue if it were done in international, under the auspices of the international safeguards.
Ashley Wilkins with the House Science Committee. I wanted to ask, several of you mentioned the potential environmental concerns in terms of in situ operation on surfaces, planetary surfaces, either from operations or from potential mishaps or accidents. And I was wondering if you could comment on, first, from a policy perspective, whether nuclear power sources and any potential environmental impacts would be counted under, considered under the Outer Space Treaty's provision against harmful contamination. And then from a just sort of the science perspective, whether how much we know about the different environments on, say, the moon and Mars in terms of temperature, atmospheric makeup, pressure, whatever, how that would impact potential environmental impacts, and whether we do know anything about that.
Sure.
Sure, great question. Great question. I think someone mentioned earlier that this is an issue that hasn't been studied too much, which is how these things will actually operate on the surface of another celestial body, what the effects of that operation might be. From a legal and policy standpoint, I think you're referring to Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that state parties need to avoid.
Article 6.
I think Article 9.
Okay, keep going.
Which avoid the harmful contamination of other celestial bodies. So that obviously the one type of that contamination could be radiological contamination. So far, that's mainly been interpreted as biological contamination under planetary protection. I mean, that doesn't mean that it can't include radiological contamination. A couple important legalese points to make there. It says specifically to avoid harmful contamination. So what that exactly means, it doesn't mean that you can't contaminate a celestial body, especially if there's an accident scenario that you're trying to mitigate that could result in that contamination. You just need to avoid it as a state party. In terms of the actual effects on celestial body environment, I don't know that. I'm not sure that many people do or have studied that thus far.
So two other points to make on that is that the presidential memorandum that just came out in August directs NASA to develop an operational plan for operation on a different celestial body. And the second point to make there is no US government agency has on-orbit authority or in-space authority. So I think that was the kernel of your question, and that is something, that's an issue to be resolved.
So as the chair and moderator, I'd like to get our panel talking a little bit more amongst themselves, or have a dialogue. And so this question is for our representatives from NASA and from STIPI. STIPI was outlining all of the things you'd have to think about in essentially a trade study between using HU fuel versus LEU fuel. NASA is in fact contributing or working on two such trade studies, as I understand it. One led by DOE, and with most of the work being done at Idaho National Laboratory, and then a second one within NASA that is looking even more broadly at all the potential uses of nuclear for space. And so my question is, conceptually, for the first STIPI, and in practice for Dr. Shihai, do those studies and should those studies address at least two of the issues that were raised by Dr. Lyman? So one of them is that the use of HEU for this civilian purpose by the United States, which has been the leader in telling other countries not to use HEU for civilian purposes, could that potentially have a cascading effect of undermining and even destroying the international norm against use of HEU, so that you would have this emergence of countries that want to use and start using HEU for research reactors, for production of Moly-99, for floating reactors, for icebreaker reactors, for naval propulsion reactors, so that you then would get this emergence of HEU commerce around the world that would greatly increase the chances of proliferation and nuclear terrorism. That could increase the chance of nuclear weapons being used against other countries or against the United States. Is that incorporated in the trade study? And then the second thing that Dr. Lyman mentioned was that because of that proliferation risk, there's actually quite a lot of potential political opposition to HEU. So that people in Congress, people in NGOs who aren't against space reactors if they use LEU would be against space reactors entirely if they used HEU. And so that's not a technical issue, that's not an economic issue, that's a political issue, and maybe it's inappropriate for certain folks to look at that, but it seems pretty darn important if you're trying to think about how are we going to get nuclear power in space. If you ignore the political side, which is something that sometimes economists do, it's quite perilous. I say that as a political scientist. Okay, in any case, if I could start the dialogue.
Sure. So I think the direct answer to your question of are we considering the broad ramifications of the utilization of HEU in terms of policy, non-proliferation, political risks in the design trade studies that we're doing? The direct answer is no, we're not. And you know, I think there exist organizations like the Science and Technology Policy Institute to address the policy side of it. What you know, I perceive our job to do in these particular studies, anyway, that you mentioned, is to look at how the design can satisfy the requirements that will allow us to do the mission. And so we've spent 4 years so far trying to develop an LEU-based fuel for NTP. At this point, I would say we don't have one yet. Steve Howe, who I respect as much as anybody in the business, came up to me before the meeting and said, hey, I've got something, we've started working on it, we've got some preliminary result, it looks like it could be promising. Steve, I think, would say there's a number of other tests and some more development we need to do before we could validate that, yeah, this will work for an NTP implementation. So we've got that in the trade space. In our fission surface power study, as I said, we don't have anything against using LEU, and if it meets our requirements, and if someone could develop a fuel that meets our timeline and our needs, we would certainly consider that and utilize that. So, you know, for our design studies, we're trying to meet the requirements that allow us to do the missions. We're laying out the options, and then the policy orgs and the political orgs, as you said, or someone said, the president would have to approve launch of certain systems. I think the White House has had to approve the launch of the plutonium systems that, you know, once a decade or so that we launch for the science missions, the Cassini orbiter, and those sorts of things. And so, you know, those folks would weigh in accordingly. You know, ultimately, our missions were given to us by the president, so he's going to have to decide if the implementation needed to do the mission is appropriate. And but we're trying to lay out those options. That's what we see our contributions being, and then I'll let Fabia take it from there.
So clearly, yes, those are important criteria that need to be considered. And you know, in any analysis that is done, whether we do it or somebody else does it, they should not only be considered but factored heavily. But since I have the microphone, I'd like to say one quick thing that I think is really important to say, especially in light of what Jeff just said. You know, Hyman Rickover, who's considered the father of nuclear navy, talked about paper reactors, and these are reactors that are simple and small and light and don't cost anything and cheap and elegant. And real reactors are heavy and expensive and behind schedule, but they're real. So I think we need to kind of also make that distinction between sort of elegant designs that satisfy all our criteria, and the fact that these criteria are oppose each other, and there are going to be some tough decisions that somebody would need to make.
Anybody else have a comment on this? Ed?
No. I mean, I guess I'm sorry to hear that DOE is not, at least, I don't know, it may not be in NASA's purview, but in the past, DOE has conducted what they call non-proliferation assessments of major federal projects. And although that practice has waned in recent years, it would seem this issue was right for DOE to at least conduct a non-proliferation assessment for NNSA defense nuclear non-proliferation, because it does to limit the scope of the issues you're considering. I think really will not get the full picture of the larger implications of what this program would actually stimulate. And so one would hope that the federal government is taking a wider view. So I guess I'm disappointed to hear that it's not.
Okay, we were meant to have stopped 10 minutes ago. One of the reasons that we haven't stopped is that it turns out that Representative Foster is currently on the House floor about to make a speech there. He is coming here, but it'll be after he makes his speech on the floor. So I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Does anyone have another question? In the back, okay. And if this stops, you just hit it, and it works. Like a reactor.
Eric Ball, Energy Research Inc. I'm curious whether plutonium has been considered as a realistic option for space reactors, either using a reactor-grade plutonium that would be difficult to turn into weapons, or using perhaps a plutonium that's been denatured with plutonium-238. Is that come into consideration?
Yeah, well, what I can tell you is we haven't been considering that, not in recent years. Now there are other folks in the room who could probably better. Who asked the question? There are some real experts here in nuclear systems and in space nuclear systems in particular, who could probably answer specifically why that is, what the considerations are. And if you'll come up to me after, I'll point you to those guys. I hate to pass it off to someone else, but I'm not the right guy to give a detailed answer to that, but I think there are people in the room who can at least shed more light on it than I can. I'll have to let you accept that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Maybe Jeff was one of these guys, actually.
Well, so there are, for that. So there are a couple of papers about, I don't know, God, at this point, probably 15 years ago, that did some trade space studies on plutonium, and actually those papers actually also looked at, I think it was curium and there were some other exotics. And they sort of concluded that, my memory on those, they were in the Space Technology and Applications International Forum, back when that was back when INSPE and ISNPS existed. They were some papers actually, if I recall correctly, came out of Los Alamos. The conclusion was that you could be a little bit smaller, but pretty much if you go plutonium or anything that has a high activity, you immediately toss out one of the main advantages of a space nuclear reactor, which is one of the nice things about space nuclear reactors is essentially non-radioactive on launch. So that a launch accident, the fuel in the reactor is really not a big deal in terms of your launch accident. But if you were to load that reactor with a fissile mass of plutonium or a fissile mass of any other fissile element, suddenly now you are in a regime where if you have a launch abort accident and a disintegration of that system, you've actually done a significant amount of contamination. And there's a much larger concern. And so that's a big chunk of the reason why we would not want to go to anything other than uranium. In that there's a lot of, put very, very, very coarsely, there's already a lot of uranium in the ocean. I mean, that's just that's a
And
fact.
we didn't put it there.
And we didn't put it there. And so it's one of the things we argue with space reactors is with the space reactor it's nice because your Curie loading is a few Curies, whereas the Curie loading, the measure of activity in an RTG is hundreds of thousands of Curies. And if you were to go with a plutonium reactor, another, you wouldn't be hundreds of thousands, but you still, well, no, you might very well be hundreds of thousands of Curies of plutonium, which from a risk standpoint would be much, much worse.
For anybody interested more generally in the concept of using plutonium for energy, we actually published a book on that topic late last year. It's called Plutonium for Energy, ? And it's available for free download, free hard copies. Just go to the NPPP website.